Hello everyone and welcome to Royals at the Ranch, episode 15. This will air on September 30th, 2021. And this week we're going to do a little bit different format. We are going to feature one of our Royals at the Ranch, and we're not really telling his story. We're just going to use part of his story as a way to educate you as to one of the options for consideration when you're transitioning a snake from one habitat that they've been in into another habitat that they've been in. And we're going to work through this situation with our Royal Ezra. And as you see here in this photo on the upper left, this is his morph market picture. He's a mahogany Mojave cinnamon, and he was produced by Reptile Creations. And then in the next photo on the lower left, you see the day he arrived. That's the box he arrived in just before I opened it. And then on the upper right, you see him in his transport container. It's just a tub that I put him in for the drive home. It's about an hour from the FedEx ship center to get to the ranch. And then in the lower right, you see that same tub where I've just added a hide and a water and a few things, and that's where he's going to start his life with us. But I like to transition them out of those tubs as soon as possible. I usually put them in a habitat that is as identical to what they were in at the breeders as possible, and usually that's going to be a rack bin or tub. But that isn't really good for their behavioral development or for their training, and it's really not good for them to learn about living in the human world. As an example, you don't want to buy a puppy that's going to be a family pet and live with you in your home that was raised isolated in a kennel situation. You wouldn't want to buy a puppy that was born and raised in a kennel. You want to buy that puppy that was born and raised in someone's kitchen, in someone's house, and grew up around the family and learned human body language and learned all of the things that are normal in a household. And ideally, you want to add a snake to your family that's been raised that same way. Unfortunately, that isn't usually how snakes are raised after hatching. And so as soon as I can, I like to get them transitioned out of a tub and into a more environmentally complex habitat where they can see out and learn about the world that they're going to be living in, and where they can learn what human behavior is like and human body language, and where we can see them. But with that said, you want to obviously give them opportunities to be away from that activity if it becomes too much for them. So you need to make sure that they have plenty of places to retreat and hide. So let's follow the journey that we took with Ezra as he transitioned from his tub into a more environmentally complex habitat. Now, these are some different options for consideration when you're transitioning a snake of any age, no matter how long they've been with you, from the habitat they've been living in into something different or something larger. So it might be a juvenile snake that you're going to move into a bigger enclosure. It might just be a snake that you've had for years that you want to move into a new enclosure. Or in the case that I'm going to show you with Ezra, it might be a new addition to your family that you want to move into some type of either permanent habitat or an intermediate habitat that they're going to live in until they're older. So the first option for consideration is to place the snake's entire living container into the larger enclosure and then leave an opening in it. Leave the door open, leave the top off, cut a hole in it. So basically nothing has changed at all for the animal, and they just think you forgot to close the door, or they have suddenly found an escape route and they can come and go as they please. That causes the least amount of distress for the animal because everything is just exactly the same for them, and they're able to just start coming out of their existing habitat as they choose and when they feel ready to do that. The second option for consideration is to use the larger enclosure or the habitat that you're going to move the snake into as an enrichment area or as an exercise space for that snake to use when it's out of its regular habitat until it becomes so comfortable, familiar with, and used to that other space because it's exercised in it and used it as an enrichment space so many times that it's no big deal to that animal when it now just stays in it permanently one day. I really like this method as well, and it works well if you can't fit the old enclosure inside the new enclosure. And then the third option, which isn't my favorite, but it's kind of neutral. That's why I have these two just black lines here. It works, but it isn't ideal. And that's to move all of the furnishings and the substrate from the snake's current living space into the new one. And you want to do that without cleaning anything. So don't clean the substrate, don't pull urates or feces out. Well, I mean, you can put clean fresh water, but don't wipe off or clean any of the furnishings. Just move everything out of the old habitat and into the new one so that all of those things are moving with your snake and they all smell the same and feel the same and look the same. And while the external space that all of those things are in has changed, nothing about the substrate or the furnishings has changed. And I know that's difficult for us because we like things to be shiny and new and clean, but this is really a good way if you have to just make that transition from one enclosure to another to minimize distress. Just move the dirty substrate or the old substrate and all the furnishings with the snake and let them get used to that new space for a while before you clean things out. And then the other option for consideration, which is my least favorite, it is going to be the most distressing for the snake, is just to move the snake from the old habitat to the new one all at once with no gradual desensitization, no prior familiarization with the new habitat, no incremental transition, and not necessarily taking any of the furnishings or old substrate or anything with it. You're just, bam, taking it out of one habitat and putting it into a completely new space. That's going to be the most distressful for your animal. All right, method one, I just want to talk about quickly. It's not the one we're going to go over in detail here, but it is my favorite. It is my absolute top recommendation for transitioning a snake from a current habitat to a new one. And that is just to put the entire living space into the new habitat. And here's a very simple example of where I have done that. If you look at the picture on the far left, you see that there's a tub inside a bigger terrarium and it has a hole in the top. And if you look at the picture just to the right of that, I've opened the lid of the tub so you can see inside. And it has paper towel substrate, a couple of hides, some plastic plants. It's got a piece of wood, like a branch, and it's got a water dish, which was actually this snake's container that it got transported here in. I just used it as a water dish for a while. And then if you look in the lower right, you can see where I had a vent in the top of that tub when the snake first lived in it, and I just took the vent out. And then that picture on the far right shows again the whole thing where I've just got the tub in a bigger terrarium. I've removed the vent so the snake could totally live in that tub and never come out if that's what he chooses, or he can go in and out of that hole until he habituates to the bigger space and I add more things to the bigger space, and eventually I then notice that he's not really using that tub anymore, and eventually you can remove it. I think this snake actually kept that tub in there for about a year, and that was not because he was living in it, just because he was using it as a hide and he would use it as a ledge to lay on top of, and he was still utilizing it until he just got so big that I took it out. The method that we're going to talk about in this video is method 2, and it's my second choice for moving a snake from one habitat to another, and that's where you're using the larger enclosure as an enrichment space or an exercise space for the snake when it's out of its other habitat, or in this case the tub that he lived in the first few days he was here, until you see that the animal is so comfortable with it that they're just not wanting to go back into their old habitat anymore, and you can just tell through their body language and behavior that they're okay staying in that new habitat. There is no set time for this process to take place. Some snakes are going to be ready to transition within just a few sessions. I've even transitioned snakes the same day they've arrived here. They've just shown me with their behavior and body language that they are over being in a tub or a shoebox or anything like that, and they have no interest in being contained in that anymore. And then I've had snakes that have transitioned within a few days or within a week or two, and occasionally you may find one that takes longer to transition with this method. But there's no set time limit, so don't get any specific time limit in your head. Yes, I think the sooner they can transition, the better, because then they can learn more about the world they are going to be living in. They're going to learn more about human behavior because they're going to be able to see out. They're going to have more behavioral choices. They're going to have more options for environmental complexity as far as exercise and things to investigate and things to do with their time. But you don't want to rush it. You want this to be their choice. And you're going to understand how this works as you see the examples that I give in this video. So again, you're going to be watching their body language and behavior to know when it's time to go ahead and leave them in the new enclosure and quit returning them to the old enclosure. Now here you see Ezra in a closet area that I used in our quarantine room. So this is where he spent about the first 24 hours or so. And I went in there several times during that period, and I just took the lid off, and then I just sat nearby and I read a book. I looked at my phone. I worked on the computer. I folded laundry. I just did regular things, regular activities that I would have been doing anyway. And I allowed him to do whatever he wanted while keeping an eye on him. And he gradually started to come out of hiding and come out of his tub a little at a time. As you see here, now I've moved the tub out of that closet and into the quarantine room at large. And I've set it in the space where his terrarium is going to go. And I just do the same thing. I go in there periodically and I remove the lid from the tub and I let him do whatever he wants while I keep an eye on him. And then now I have added the terrarium. This is his future living space, not his permanent living space, obviously. It's still fairly small, although it's bigger than his tub. I've got it sitting here and I have put his tub on the floor adjacent to it and I took the lid off and I just followed the same procedure. I sat in there with him and I did other things while keeping an eye on him. And he was free to stay in the tub. He was free to leave the tub. He could have explored the floor, that cart, wherever it was safe for him to explore. I let him explore. And eventually he found his way to the terrarium and he was very intrigued by it. And he spent some time investigating it. And you can see that there's no hide in it right now. There's no water in it right now, that it's minimally furnished because he is not living in it yet. At this point where he's investigating it, it's just there ready for him, and he's using it as an activity. He's using it as an exercise space and an enrichment area. So this is an activity that he has an opportunity to engage in if he chooses. I did not take him out of his hide. He came out on his own. He had already been coming out of the tub and exploring around the immediate area. I didn't pull him out of the tub. I didn't touch him at all. I just set the tub here and took the lid off, and he chose to climb into this terrarium and explore it. And that's excellent, because the more he does this, the more he becomes used to it. Then one day, when I move his hide and his water and other furnishings in there and leave him in it permanently, it really isn't going to be any big deal to him because he is already very familiar with it. Now you should be able to see here that Ezra is exploring the habitat on a different day than in the previous video, and that's because there are additional furnishings in it. He's got water in it. I've dampened the sphagnum moss in his humid hide. I've added rocks, and you'll see that his log hide is now in here, and that's because I feel like it's time for him to permanently move into this habitat. His tub is still sitting adjacent to it, and so he is free to move back into his tub if he wants to, or explore inside the habitat. And he's chosen to go in the habitat and explore. And I left the door open. I didn't close it right away. I didn't move his tub. I sat with him for quite a long time, and I allowed him to go in and out of the terrarium if he chose to explore all of his surroundings and make sure that he was 100% comfortable with being in there. I made sure that he noticed his log hide was in there and that he had an opportunity to smell that. I made sure that none of the new things in there distressed him at all, like the rocks or the water dish, which was a different water dish than the one he was used to in his tub. And again, I wasn't in a hurry. I had other things to do, so I was able to just sit there with him, hands off, and let him do his thing, and just observe whether he was going to remain comfortable and relaxed and choose to remain in the terrarium, or whether he was going to choose to come out and go back in his tub. Here you see that he's very comfortable in it. And one of the clues is that he's drinking water. He's explored the habitat. He's comfortable enough that he's drinking. He found the water. He's chosen to take a drink. The door is open. We aren't going to suddenly close the door the first time the snake goes into the habitat on the day that we intend to leave them in there. We still want to make sure it's the right decision. And so we want to leave that door open. And we want to give that animal every opportunity to still come out if they choose, and return to their old living space if they choose. So his tub is still sitting there. In fact, he went in and out several times before he sort of stayed in there for a very long time, and he started drinking. And that was a big clue to me that it was probably the right decision to go ahead and leave him permanently in this space now. Now you see he's investigating the glass, and that's not unusual. It is very difficult for them to visually determine what glass is, and they have an issue with transparent barriers because to them it looks like there's nothing there, and it's confusing because they feel that there's something there and they can't get through it. And so that's what he was investigating there. And here he is coming out the door. Like I said, you don't want to just shut him in there all of a sudden. You want him to have the opportunity to go in and out as much as he feels like he needs to be comfortable, and really show you that he's made that decision that he prefers to stay in that space versus the space that he was in before. And this is not the same day as the previous video. This is a different day, and I am still going in there several times a day and opening the door and allowing him the opportunity to come out if he chooses. So even once I've left him in there for what I intend to be permanently, or until he outgrows this and needs a bigger enclosure, I still go in there every day and I open the door whether he comes out or not, because that's giving him an opportunity to come out if he chooses, and it's habituating him to my presence and the smells and the activity in the room without forcing him to engage in anything. So I'm not reaching in there and pulling him out. I'm not touching him at all. I'm just simply going in there and opening the door, and then I'm in there doing chores or working or doing other things and keeping an eye on him at the same time. So this is just his time to come out if he chooses, to stay in there if he chooses. I even do this if they're hiding. I do this if they appear to be resting or sleeping. I just open the door, I leave it open while I'm in there, and then I close it when I leave the room, whether they've come out or not. This is the same day, and it's just him with a little bit more of a close-up video. I think he's a very pretty snake, so I got really close up here, and he's investigating the habitat of the snake next to him, who is also in the quarantine room because they arrived really close together. And then when he's had enough, he chose to go back into the terrarium. His tub is there. He could have gone into a tub. I always still keep it nearby in case he feels like he wants to go in there. Or I keep the old habitat nearby if it's practical to do that for a while, just to make sure that the snake is acclimating well to the new space. But he did. He acclimated very well and clearly chose to move into this new space. Remember that this is a process and a progression. And this process may take a short time, or the progression may take a very long time from our perspective. Now, we don't know how snakes perceive time, but you just need to remember to be patient and allow this process to happen. Allow it to unfold when the snake is ready and at the snake's own pace. Don't do anything to try to hurry it along. You want to make sure that the snake is the one determining how this progresses. Believe me, you will be able to tell when the snake is ready for each of the additional approximations based on their body language and behavior. Remember that your role in this process is to be there for the snake and support the snake's well-being as it transitions from its old living space into its new living space, and during the whole transition process from its old home to your home. You're there to facilitate the process, to keep the snake safe and observe for signs of fear, anxiety, and distress. Please make sure that you are watching their body language and that you're familiar with the body language chart that's on the home page of my website. Please make sure that you're able to recognize signs of fear, anxiety, and distress in your snake, that you're able to recognize when they're comfortable and relaxed with something, when they're being stretched outside of their comfort zone, but it's still okay to let things continue because they're learning and growing through that process. But you also need to recognize when they're approaching threshold, when they are distressed, and when they can no longer cope with what's happening. So again, you want to be supportive of this process, and you want to keep the snake safe and make sure that they aren't getting distressed by anything that's going on as you're trying to make this process happen. I hope that this video has made it really clear how you can gradually and smoothly transition your snake from one living space to another using method 2. But I do want to emphasize that if you are not a patient person, if you're not able to restrain yourself from staying hands off during this process, if you're not able to just refrain from touching your snake or pulling your snake out of the tub and putting them in the new habitat, if you're not able to just open doors or lids and observe, then method 1 is probably the best one for you, because all you're doing then is putting the snake's old habitat into the new habitat and you're leaving it be. You don't have to sit there and watch them. You don't have to sit there and make sure that they're safe, because it's a self-contained process that can happen in the snake's own time, and you don't have to even be present. So if you're not patient and you're not willing to just sit nearby and make sure that the snake is safe while it goes through the process to do method 2, then please somehow figure out how to do method 1. And at any rate, I think method 1 is always the best way to transition a snake from an old habitat to a new one, because it is the least distressful for the animal. So much for joining me this week, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. And otherwise, until next time, everybody, please remember to always be kind and love your animals.